So welcome everybody, good afternoon. Thank you for coming to this presentation on barriers to the profession for people of color, how the culture of whiteness in libraries excludes marginalized groups. My name is Laura Giacobbe. I use the pronouns she and her, and I am a specialist librarian at Monmouth University in West Long Branch, New Jersey.
I'm Chrisler Pitts. I use the pronouns she, her, and I am the collection development and acquisitions librarian at Kean University in Union, New Jersey.
Okay, we ready recording. And thank you to our founding partner, the San Jose State University School of Information.
Our session will follow this format: the state of diversity in the United States, the cost of higher education, why BIPOC leave the profession, recommendations, and we will end with a Q&A. We'd like to begin this session with a land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge that the land we are privileged to work and live upon is that of the Lenape. This indigenous group's land was fraudulently removed during colonization. We hope to honor these ancestors of the past and the present generation as well, as we work to dismantle all systems of oppression. Our hope is that we can all be better partners with the land we live upon and with each other as well. We are grateful to the Lenape for their stewardship of this land. To learn more about universities who were founded on seized and violence-based land seizures, go to landgrabu.org.
Throughout this presentation, when we are referring to white culture, we mean the dominant culture here in the United States, the system of being that is so built into life here that we don't often see or acknowledge how deep it is. Chrisler and I are academic librarians, and we are focusing on that aspect of librarianship within the higher education system. And all of our data and statistics are based on the United States. So let's look at some statistics.
How diverse is the United States? Over a decade or so, we see that the United States has grown more racially and ethnically diverse, with the largest increase in the Latinx population and the largest decrease in the white population. But does a more diverse population mean we are more integrated? Though the United States has become much more diverse in its population, it does not mean that we are more integrated. The U.S. continues to be a society where most people live in racial segregation and do not have lasting relationships with groups outside of their own. It's important to note that these statistics specifically refer to friendships, not work colleagues. It's also a known fact that relationships with coworkers are not as deep and impactful as friendships. Now let's see if the wealth gap has changed.
Here you can see how vast the racial wealth gap is still for Black and Hispanic people versus the Asian and white population. The median net worth rose for white households, but slipped for Black and Hispanic households. Black and Hispanic households increased their wealth in a greater amount than whites over the last few years. And that is typically because they tend to have higher mortgages and the value of their debt increased with inflation. So the combination of the rising house prices and the high mortgage debt for these groups has led to this increase. Now let's take a look at the gender wage gap. So the wage gap is still persistent for women. The most recent Bureau of Labor statistics show that women in full-time positions earn about 82 cents to the dollar compared to men. But when you add in race, this gap becomes more pronounced. There is a significant difference in pay between males who are Black or Hispanic compared to their Asian or white counterparts. However, it is Hispanic women who are the lowest paid for equal work. Now let's take a look at higher education.
How diverse is higher education? Faculty are overwhelmingly white. The overall rate of college enrollment has decreased from 2010, but this was driven by the decline in enrollment for two-year colleges. The enrollment rate of females is higher, and Asians are represented at a higher rate than all other ethnic groups. However, it is noticeable that the diversity of the students is greater than that of the faculty. Let's dive a little deeper into the faculty. How have faculty changed on campuses? We see that women and underrepresented minorities have a higher rate of being part-time faculty. Overall, faculty have shifted from being mostly tenure-track to primarily contingent faculty, lecturers, and adjuncts. Now let's look at how cost in higher education have changed.
Adjusted for inflation, we see that the cost of higher education has continued to rise since the 70s. Tuition rates have increased over 747% since 1963. And when we also look at the student loan debt, we know that Black graduates will incur more student debt than white graduates, and they will continue to hold on to that debt over 188% higher than their white peers in a 4-year time period. Black students will have over 40% of their debt from graduate school compared to 22% for whites. Latinx borrowers will delay major life events like marriage due to their debt. What we really see here from these statistics is the enormous inequity around student debt and generational wealth. Now let's see how libraries measure up.
How diverse are libraries? There seems to be a lack of diversity in terms of librarians and educators in library schools. It's quite noticeable that the majority of them are white. However, among the support staff, there is more diversity. They tend to be more representative of the communities they serve. And when we look at library professionals' employment, it's worth noting that librarians tend to be older than the general workforce. Also, a 2023 fact sheet from the AFL-CIO noted that in 2022, unionized librarians earn 37% more on a weekly basis compared to non-unionized librarians. And let's look at librarian salaries. In the most recent library job satisfaction survey, the #1 complaint was about low pay, both for public and academic librarians. And the second was not having enough support staff. In fact, Carla Hayden, the Librarian of Congress, talked about this in a school library journal article. People have more options today. There weren't many options at certain times in our history for people of color, and once more fields opened and there were more opportunities, people chose other professions that paid better. So you might be asking, why have we shown you all of these statistics? All these things contribute to the system in place in the United States that benefits the privileged and adds a barrier to BIPOC. We have to look at all these factors to understand why librarianship remains white with very little representation from other groups. Let's look at some of those more pronounced barriers.
Now here we take a look at some of the hidden costs and fees of librarianship. In a 2020 survey, over 89% of librarians reported that their promotions were contingent upon professional development, but over 80% had to self-fund much of these activities, especially membership fees. And 75% reported not having done professional development, specifically due to costs. In academics, many institutions don't cover things like membership fees, which can be costly, and conference fees are usually capped at a certain dollar amount. For BIPOC, having networks of fellow BIPOC librarians is extremely important because we know that many will work in isolation. Offering financial support to join groups like Reforma or BCALA can help level the playing field for BIPOC. When recommending librarianship to BIPOC, consider we need to be aware of the rising costs of higher education overall, the inequity in wealth and wage in the United States, the low pay of the profession, the lack of advancement opportunities, and the potential isolation or de facto segregation that occurs in many libraries today. So how do potential librarians see barriers to librarianship? This question and response that you see here in this slide is from survey findings conducted by the BBL in July of this year. The BIPOC Become Librarians received funding from a $150,000 grant from the Laura Bush 21st Century Librarian Program. There was also a $478,000 grant from IMLS awarded to researchers identifying opportunities for retention of BIPOC librarians. And that is still going on with a hopeful completion date of 2024. So this shows us that there is an opportunity to learn more about why BIPOC leave the profession and others in the field who are already researching this area.
Why do BIPOC leave the profession? A more pertinent question would be, how can we encourage BIPOC librarians to stay? What factors contribute to job satisfaction? In an article by Trevor Riley-Weed, we learn about multifaceted issues, including systemic racism and lack of support. Additionally, there is pressure to conform to the dominant culture, which is primarily white. Faculty members of color hired in academic libraries are often They often enter through non-tenure track channels via instructor or adjunct lines. Many underlying factors cause BIPOC librarians to leave academia, and these points mentioned are just a few documented in recent literature. But are librarians okay? Librarians are not okay. There are beliefs about librarians that we consistently hear, such as the notion that the job is a special calling or vocation. Obazi Etra describes this behavior and terms it vocational awe. A librarian is a highly educated and skilled worker. Compensation should reflect that. In a keynote speech by writer Ann Peterson, she describes our work as passion work and discusses how these positions can be prime for exploitation. Now let's look at some systemic barriers that are in place.
How does the end of affirmative action impact higher education? In her dissenting opinion, Justice Sotomayor writes, "The court concludes that indifference to race is the only constitutionally permissible means to achieve racial equality in college admissions. That interpretation of the 14th Amendment is grounded in the illusion that racial inequality was a problem of a different generation. Entrenched racial inequality remains a reality today. Ignoring race will not equalize a society that is already racially unequal. Equality requires acknowledgement of inequality." We saw statistically, even before the Supreme Court ruling that ended affirmative action, access to premier institutions, the Ivy Plus, was extremely limited for BIPOC students. One article shows that Howard University and HBCU has more Black students than all other 8 Ivy League schools combined. In states that have eliminated affirmative action, studies have consistently found declines in the admission and enrollment of BIPOC. These declines are especially concentrated in selective and flagship institutions. So in Reparative Universities by author González Toques, states that diversity efforts, she states that diversity efforts in the form of trainings, workshops, affinity groups, mandates, bias awareness, anti-racism awareness, statements, councils, and task forces have not yet had any real significance. Despite these efforts, the demographics have remained the same, leaving those who work in DEI frustrated. It is important to note that inclusion work alone cannot change systems of oppression and bring diverse representation at the highest levels, such as boards, presidents, tenured professors. We have to consider that representation alone may not be effective for true inclusion and a sense of belonging for BIPOC. For institutions that have enacted changes, like having a DEI office on campus or offering diversity trainings, those places have not made any significant statistical improvements in terms of helping BIPOC with burdening student debt. Many are committed to DEI, but reparative work gets to the root of the system of inequality that runs deep in the United States. They are both needed to realize change. Now, let's take a look back in time and see how the MLIS degree came about and if a master's degree is really needed for librarians. The requirements for the degree that you can see here in this timeline, how it has changed over the years. The salary offered is not particularly comparable to other positions that are comparable. For example, engineers who sometimes do not even have a master's degree. Some scholars argue that the nature of the work has not changed that much since its inception, and an advanced degree is not necessary. Historically, many states offered apprenticeships to those already working in a library, creating an alternate route for librarianship. Consider jobs that required more intense training, like lawyers and bar exams. During the same time period when the standards for librarianship were changing, they offered apprenticeships leading to taking a written or oral test to pass the bar. This option is actually still available in 4 states today. It's curious to note that librarianship had more stringent formal education requirements. Let's take a look at the backdrop when the standards started changing. During that time, the South was still segregated, and the majority of Black Americans lived in that area. Libraries in large Southern cities had no access to branches until as late as 1913. and even then they were segregated under the separate and equal clause. As the standards for librarianship changed, Blacks were denied entry to white Southern schools and had limited access to librarianship. Although the ALA claimed to support Blacks, it still allowed membership of segregated libraries. Later, the ALA renounces segregation without explicit action, and a widely pushed neutrality mindset was encouraged. E.J. Josie states, mainstream institutions such as the ALA do not reflect the diverse cultures and values of the larger society. Rather, they mirror the ideals of the dominant culture. And it was not until 2021 that the ALA adopted a new ethic on racial and social justice that explicitly states that libraries cannot remain neutral places any longer. I would argue that we may wish to revisit some of the standards that were historically created for librarians and see if there can be other pathways to librarianship, such as by apprenticeships or credit for years worked in a library. This would open more opportunities for support staff to advance, and as we learn, support staff tends to be more diverse in racial and ethnic compositions within libraries. This would also allow more opportunity for those who are socioeconomically disadvantaged to enter the profession, since we have learned that the cost of education continues to rise at levels that are unprecedented. Now, let us offer you some additional recommendations for supporting BIPOC librarians.
What can be done to foster not only better BIPOC representation, but foster a sense of belonging and connection? Provide scholarships and fellowships for library school. It's also crucial to prioritize creating a welcoming environment that supports BIPOC librarians. This can be achieved through various means, such as offering mentoring, networking, and advancement opportunities, as well as providing research support and professional development opportunities. It's important to avoid assuming that BIPOC individuals are interested in participating in DEI initiatives and committees, and instead make an effort to build genuine friendships with them. When we take the time to get to know others, we realize that we are all more alike than different. Laura and I have benefited from mentorships, friendships, and partnerships with fellow librarians. We hope that everything we presented to you today will make you think twice about how you can support BIPOC librarians.
And in closing, we would like to offer you some other recommendation and resources for reading. And so we'd be happy to share our slides with you if you're interested, or we'd be happy to stay in touch with you. This is our contact information on the slide. And I have not been monitoring the chat, but I believe Barbara has. And I think we have a few minutes for questions if anyone has a question or comment. Okay, yeah, I see a few people asking about the slides. Yeah, we'd be happy to share the slides with you.
We have our first question in the chat. One of our participants asks, are there any suggestions for making tuition free?
Well, some states and some universities already offer free tuition. But so for example, Princeton University offers free tuition, but does it really have access for BIPOC people? We know that statistically that the rates for entry for BIPOC people into the Ivy Plus is very low. So I think it's a combination of things. So you may get free tuition, but you have to still get into Princeton, which is going to be very difficult for somebody who is a BIPOC person. So I think you have to look at everything all together. And yes, I see someone's comment about Katrina Davis Kendrick. Yes, we are familiar with her work, and she is an inspiration, and we have read some of her things as well. And Barbara, should I stop the recording?
It's up to you if you would like to feature the question portion.
Okay, I'm going to do that.
And we have another question in the chat. Um,